We just want a peaceful Christmas this year, so please don't come." That was the message my son sent me at 6:42 p.m. on December 23rd. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something softer, something that didn't feel like a door quietly closing in my face. They didn't. The little gray bubbles beneath his name disappeared, leaving only silence where there used to be warmth. I stared at the screen until it dimmed, my reflection faintly staring back at me, older than I remembered, the soft glow of the Christmas lights behind me flickering in the glass. For a moment, I considered calling him, asking what he meant, asking how a mother becomes someone you politely exclude. But I didn't. Instead, I typed one word: enjoy. I pressed send before I could change my mind, before the ache in my chest could turn into something louder, something messier. The message delivered instantly. No reply came. The house was already decorated. It had been for weeks. I'd set up the tree the day after Thanksgiving, just like I always did, carefully placing each ornament the way my husband used to like them. The old glass angel sat at the top, slightly crooked, because I could never quite reach the same way he did. Beneath the tree, wrapped boxes waited patiently, each labeled in my neat, deliberate handwriting. Daniel, Rachel, little Sophie. I'd even bought the expensive wrapping paper this year, the kind with the gold trim, because Sophie once told me it looked fancy like in the movies. I smoothed my hand over one of the boxes now, feeling the slight crinkle of the paper under my palm. I had imagined her face when she opened it, the small gasp, the quick hug. I had imagined all of it. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cinnamon and baked apples. Earlier that afternoon, I'd prepared the pie dough, rolling it out slowly, carefully, just as my mother had taught me. The counters were clean, the dishes put away, everything ready for a Christmas Eve that was no longer going to happen here. I walked into the dining room and looked at the table. For place settings. For plates. For glasses. I had set them without thinking, my hands moving. Out of habit, muscle memory guiding me through a ritual I had performed for decades. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chairs, trying to remember when it had started to feel like I was no longer part of the picture. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It was small things at first. Shorter phone calls. Missed visits. Little comments from Rachel about how busy they were, how things had changed. I had told myself it was normal. That families grow, shift, make space. I didn't realize I was the one being moved out of it. I turned off the dining room light, leaving the table in shadow, and walked back into the living room where the tree still glowed softly, steady, and indifferent. Outside, a light snow had started to fall, dusting the street in quiet white. It looked peaceful. That was the word he used. Peaceful. I wondered what part of me had disturbed that peace so much that my absence became the solution. I picked up my phone again, not to text, not to call, but just to hold it, as if it might explain something if I waited long enough. It didn't. The house was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that comforts you. It was the kind that settles in, heavy and deliberate, as if it knows it's been invited to stay. I sat down in my armchair, the one by the window, and folded my hands in my lap. For the first time in a long while, I didn't try to fix anything. I didn't reach out. I didn't make excuses for them. I just sat there, listening to the quiet, letting it say what no one else would. They wanted a peaceful Christmas. And for the first time, I was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. The next morning arrived without ceremony, the pale winter light slipping through the curtains as if it had forgotten what day it was supposed to be. I woke up at the same time I always did, out of habit more than necessity, and for a moment I lay still, listening. The house was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because it had never been quiet before, but because there was no expectation waiting behind it. No footsteps upstairs, no muffled laughter from the kitchen, no sound of wrapping paper being torn open too early by an impatient child. Just the low hum of the heater and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the cold. I sat up slowly, pulling the blanket tighter around my shoulders, and let my eyes drift toward the doorway, as if someone might appear there out of routine. No one did. In the kitchen, everything was exactly as I had left it the night before. The counters were clean, the pie still resting untouched beneath a glass dome, the coffee pot empty. I moved through the space quietly, filling the kettle, measuring the grounds, performing each step with a kind of deliberate care that felt almost ceremonial. The smell of coffee rose slowly, filling the room, warm and familiar, but it did not carry the same comfort it used to. I poured myself a cup and stood by the window, watching the snow settle over the yard. The footprints I had made yesterday evening had already begun to disappear, softened by a fresh layer of white, as if the world was gently erasing any sign that I had been there at all. I took a sip and let the warmth spread through me, steady but distant, like something I recognized but could not fully feel. Across town, I imagined Daniel's house filled with light and noise, the kind of noise that spills into every corner and makes a place feel alive. I could picture Rachel moving through the kitchen, efficient and composed, directing everything with that quiet authority she carried so naturally. I could picture Sophie sitting cross-legged on the floor, her small hands tugging at ribbons, her voice rising in excitement. For years, that had been my morning too. Not anymore. I set the cup down and walked into the living room, where the tree still stood exactly as it had the night before, glowing softly, its lights unwavering. The presents beneath it looked almost out of place now, like they belonged to a different story that had somehow wandered into this one by mistake. I knelt down and picked up the smallest box, the one with Sophie's name on it, and turned it over in my hands. It felt lighter than I expected, or maybe I was just holding it differently. I placed it back carefully, aligning it with the others, as if order still mattered in a space that no longer required it. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time that felt strangely irrelevant. I found myself moving through the house again, adjusting small things that did not need adjusting, straightening a frame that was already straight, folding a blanket that had not been used. It was not about the objects. It was about the motion, the quiet reassurance of doing something, anything, that made the hours feel less empty. At some point, I realized I had not checked my phone. It sat on the side table where I had left it, screen dark, silent. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, feeling its weight. No new messages. No missed calls. Just the same short exchange from the night before, still sitting there, unchanged. I did not open it again. I did not need to. Instead, I set it back down and walked toward the front door. The cold air met me the moment I stepped outside, sharp and clean, carrying the faint scent of pine and something distant, something almost forgotten. The neighborhood was still, each house holding its own version of the morning, its own collection of voices and laughter hidden behind closed doors. I stood there for a moment, looking out at the quiet street, and realized that nothing had ended the way I once thought it would. It had not broken apart in a single moment. It had simply shifted, slowly and quietly, until one day I found myself standing outside of it, looking in. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a second longer than necessary, letting the silence settle again, not fighting it this time, just letting it be what it was. I stayed outside longer than I needed to, long enough for the cold to settle into my bones and remind me that I was still here, still part of a world that moved forward whether I felt included in it or not. When I finally stepped back inside, the warmth of the house wrapped around me again, but it felt different now, quieter in a way that was no longer waiting for interruption. I hung my coat carefully, smoothing the fabric as if the gesture still mattered, then walked slowly toward the hallway where a row of framed photographs lined the wall. I had passed them thousands of times without really seeing them, but that morning I stopped. The first frame held a picture from years ago, Daniel at 10 years old, standing in front of the tree with a grin so wide it nearly split his face. His hands were covered in wrapping paper scraps, his cheeks flushed from excitement, and just out of frame, I knew I had been standing there, watching him, laughing. I could almost hear it if I listened hard enough. The next frame showed a later Christmas, Daniel taller now, awkward in that in-between stage, trying to act older than he was while still reaching for traditions he had not quite outgrown. I remembered how he used to stay up late with me on Christmas Eve, insisting he was just helping, even though he could barely keep his eyes open. He would sit at the kitchen counter, chin resting in his hand, asking questions about everything and nothing, just to stay awake a little longer. I moved to the last frame, the most recent one, taken just a few years ago. Daniel stood beside Rachel, his arm resting lightly around her shoulders, the distance between us barely noticeable to anyone who did not know where to look. Sophie stood in front of them, her small hand gripping mine, her smile bright and unguarded. In that photo, everything still looked whole, or at least convincing enough to pass for it. I reached out and adjusted the frame, though it was not crooked, and felt a strange kind of clarity settle in. It had not changed overnight. The shift had been gradual, almost polite in its progression. A holiday spent at their house instead of mine. Then a shorter visit the following year. Then a suggestion that maybe it would be easier if I came by later, after the morning rush. Each change had come wrapped in reason, in convenience, in that careful tone Rachel used when she wanted something to sound considerate. And I had agreed, every time. Not because I did not notice, but because I told myself it was temporary, that it was just part of adjusting to a new family dynamic. I stepped back from the wall and let my hand fall to my side. The truth was quieter than I expected. There had been no single moment where I was pushed out. There had only been a series of small decisions, each one easier than the last, until eventually there was nothing left for me to step into. I walked back into the living room and sat down, my eyes drifting once more to the tree, to the presence that still waited beneath it. For a long time, I had believed that love was something you proved by showing up, by making space, by adjusting yourself to fit the needs of others. I had believed that if I was patient enough, understanding enough, it would be returned in the same way. But sitting there now, in a house that felt both familiar and foreign at the same time, I realized something else. Not all absences are accidental. Some are chosen. And once that choice is made, quietly and repeatedly, it becomes something else entirely. Something that does not need to be explained because it has already been lived, one small moment at a time. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a brief second, not to escape, but to gather myself, to hold on to that clarity before it slipped away into something softer, something easier to ignore. When I opened them again, the room looked the same, but I did not. And for the first time, that difference felt like something I could actually use. By late afternoon, the light had shifted into that muted gray that always comes before evening in the winter, soft and quiet, as if the day itself was lowering its voice. I found myself back in the kitchen without remembering how I had gotten there, standing in front of the counter where everything was still neatly arranged, waiting for a purpose that no longer existed. The pie sat untouched, its surface perfectly golden, the edges carefully crimped the way I had learned decades ago. I ran my finger lightly along the edge, not to taste it, just to feel the shape of something I had made with intention. For years, this kitchen had been the center of everything. Every holiday, every celebration, every moment that mattered seemed to pass through this space at some point. Daniel used to sit at that same counter, his legs swinging just above the floor when he was too small to reach, asking if he could help even when helping meant making more of a mess than anything else. I would hand him something simple, a spoon to stir, a bowl to hold, just so he could feel included. He always smiled when I did that, like it meant something bigger than it probably did. I turned slightly and looked at the chair where he used to sit, the wood worn smooth from years of use. And for a moment it felt as though the past was still close enough to touch, just beneath the surface of everything that had come after. But memories do not stay still. They shift when you look at them long enough. I remembered the first time Rachel joined us for Christmas, how carefully she observed everything, how politely she smiled, how quickly she seemed to understand the rhythm of the house. At the time, I had been grateful for that. It felt like she was trying to belong. I did not see how easily belonging can turn into something else when it is paired with quiet control. She never raised her voice. She never said anything directly unkind. Instead, she suggested small changes. Maybe it would be easier if dinner started a little earlier. Maybe it would be better if gifts were opened in a different order. Maybe it made more sense for them to host the following year, just to give me a break. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern, in logic, in that careful tone that made refusal feel unreasonable. And I had agreed, every time, because I thought that was what keeping a family together required. Flexibility, understanding, space. I picked up a dish towel and folded it slowly, aligning the edges with more care than necessary, and placed it back on the counter. It was not the changes themselves that had done it. It was how naturally they had been accepted, how quickly they became the new normal. One year, they hosted. The next year, they hosted again. Then the invitations became less certain, more conditional, shaped around what worked best for them. I was still included, but in a way that felt increasingly optional. I moved to the sink and turned on the faucet, letting the water run over my hands even though there was nothing to wash. The warmth was steady, grounding in a way that the rest of the day had not been. I watched the water move, clear and continuous, and thought about how easily something can keep flowing even as everything around it changes. When I turned it off, the silence returned immediately, filling the space as if it had been waiting just outside the door. I dried my hands and stood there for a moment longer, looking around the kitchen not as it used to be, but as it was now. Still, ordered, empty in a way that no amount of preparation could fix. And in that stillness, something settled into place. Not anger, not even sadness in the way I had expected. Just a quiet understanding that what I had been holding on to was no longer being held on the other side. And once that becomes clear, you stop reaching the same way. You stop waiting for things to return to what they were, because you finally see that they are not coming back. I turned off the overhead light and let the room fall into shadow, leaving only the faint glow from the living room to spill into the doorway. It was enough to see by. It was enough to move forward without needing anything more. The evening settled in slowly, wrapping the house in a dim, quiet stillness that felt almost deliberate, as if it understood there was no need to rush anything forward. I turned on the small lamp beside my chair instead of the overhead lights, letting the softer glow define the room in gentler edges. The tree lights flickered steadily, their reflection dancing faintly across the window, and for a moment it almost looked like movement, like something alive. I sat down again, folding my hands in my lap, and allowed myself to simply exist in the space without trying to change it. The clock ticked somewhere behind me, marking each second with quiet precision, but it no longer felt like something I needed to keep up with. My eyes drifted once more to the presents beneath the tree, and this time, instead of imagining how they would be received, I found myself thinking about when I had bought them. Each one had been chosen with care, not out of obligation, but out of habit, out of a belief that these small gestures still held meaning on both sides. I remembered standing in the store, turning each item over in my hands, picturing the reactions, the smiles, the conversations that would follow. It had never occurred to me that those moments might only exist in my imagination. I leaned forward slightly and picked up one of the boxes again, feeling its weight, then set it back down with the same careful attention. It was not about the gift itself. It was about what it represented, a connection I had assumed was still intact. From across the room, my phone lit up briefly, the screen glowing against the dark surface of the table. I did not move right away. I watched it for a moment, the light fading just as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the room dim again. When I finally reached for it, there was a single notification. A message, not from Daniel, from an unknown number at first glance, until I looked closer and recognized it as belonging to my granddaughter, Sophie. My fingers paused just above the screen for a second longer than necessary before I opened it. The message was short, almost careless in its delivery, as if it had been sent without much thought behind it. Grandma, Mom says we are doing Christmas at home this year because it is easier without extra stress. I hope you are okay. I read it once, then again, letting the words settle in. Easier without extra stress. It was a simple sentence, the kind that could pass unnoticed in conversation, the kind that did not sound harsh unless you stopped to consider what it implied. I did not need to ask what that stress was. I had already been given the answer, just not in words that direct. I lowered the phone slowly, resting it back on the table, and sat there in silence, allowing the meaning to fully take shape. It was not just about being left out. It was about how I had been defined in my absence, not as someone missed or even considered, but as something that complicated things, something that needed to be removed for everything else to work properly. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly, the breath leaving me steadier than I expected. There was no sharp sting this time, no sudden wave of hurt, just a quiet confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. The clarity did not come all at once, but it settled in, firmly, like a piece finally fitting into place after being turned the wrong way for too long. I looked around the room again, at the tree, at the carefully arranged decorations, at the space I had prepared with so much intention, and for the first time, I saw it not as something waiting to be filled, but as something complete on its own terms. I reached for my phone once more, not to respond right away, but to hold it, to feel its weight in my hand as I considered what needed to be said, if anything at all. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the ground in a quiet, even layer that erased edges and softened outlines. It did not ask permission. It did not wait to be invited. It simply settled where it fell, creating something new without needing acknowledgement. I watched it for a moment through the window, then lowered my gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible shift passing through me. They had made their choice. And now, without raising my voice, without demanding explanation, I was beginning to make mine. The night stretched on in a quiet, unbroken line, and for the first time in years, I did not feel the need to fill it. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for background noise to soften the edges of the silence. Instead, I let it stay steady and present, like something that had finally been given permission to exist. The message from Sophie lingered in my mind, not because of how it was written, but because of how easily it had been said. Children repeat what they hear. They do not shape the meaning. They simply carry it forward, easier without extra stress. I repeated the phrase once in my head, not with bitterness, but with a kind of measured clarity. It was not cruel in tone. It was practical. That was what made it settle so deeply. I stood up slowly and walked toward the hallway again, passing the photographs without stopping this time, moving with a purpose that felt new, unfamiliar in its certainty. At the end of the hall, just beyond the small linen closet, was a door I had not opened in months. My husband's study. I rested my hand on the knob for a moment, feeling the cool metal beneath my fingers, then turned it gently and stepped inside. The air was different in there, still carrying a faint trace of his aftershave, subtle but unmistakable, like something time had not quite managed to erase. The desk sat exactly as he had left it, papers neatly stacked, a pen placed carefully beside them, his reading glasses folded with precision near the edge. I moved closer, my steps quiet against the carpet, and ran my fingers lightly along the surface of the wood. He had always believed in order, in preparation, in making sure things were exactly where they needed to be before anything else moved forward. At the time, I had thought it was just his way of staying organized. Now, standing there, I realized it had been something more, a kind of quiet protection. I opened the top drawer slowly, the soft slide of wood against wood breaking the stillness, and inside, everything was exactly as I remembered. Files arranged in careful rows, each one labeled in his precise handwriting. I did not hesitate. I reached for the folder I already knew would be there, the one he had shown me once, years ago, with a gentle seriousness that I had not fully understood at the time. Just in case, he had said, his voice calm, steady, as if he were discussing something routine. I had nodded then, trusting him without needing to know every detail. Now, I lifted the folder out and placed it on the desk, opening it with steady hands. The papers inside were organized, clear, deliberate. Property records, account summaries, legal documents that carried weight not because of their complexity, but because of what they represented. Ownership, intention, control. I read through them slowly, not rushing, letting each detail settle into place, aligning itself with everything I had come to understand over the past day. The house, the accounts, everything had been structured carefully, intentionally, in a way that did not rely on assumption or expectation. It was not about trust. It was about clarity. I closed the folder gently and rested my hand on top of it, feeling a calm settle over me that was different from anything I had felt before. Not relief, not comfort, something steadier, something grounded. I had spent so much time adjusting, accommodating, stepping back to make space for others, believing that it was the right thing to do, that it would preserve something worth keeping. But standing there now, in a room that had been built on quiet foresight, I understood that preserving something does not always mean holding on to it in the same way. Sometimes it means recognizing when its shape has changed and deciding what still belongs to you. I picked up the folder again and placed it neatly back where it had been, aligning it with the others, restoring the order that had always defined this space. Then I closed the drawer and stepped back, taking one last look around the room, not with nostalgia, but with acknowledgement. He had prepared for this in his own way, not for the moment itself, but for what would come after. I turned off the light and closed the door behind me, the quiet of the hallway meeting me once again, but it no longer felt empty. It felt resolved. And as I walked back toward the living room, the soft glow of the tree waiting ahead, I realized that the next step did not require urgency or emotion. It only required decision. And for the first time, I was ready to make one. I did not rush the decision. The night had already taught me that there was no need for urgency, no reward for reacting too quickly to something that had taken years to quietly unfold. Instead, I returned to my chair by the window and sat down once more, letting the soft glow of the tree settle into the corners of the room. The phone rested on the table beside me, silent, unchanged, but now it felt less like something I was waiting on and more like something I would use when I chose to. I picked it up slowly and scrolled through my contacts, my finger pausing briefly over Daniel's name before moving past it without hesitation. There was nothing I needed to say to him tonight. Not yet. Instead, I continued down the list until I reached a name I had not called in quite some time. Thomas Reynolds, my husband's attorney. The man who had sat at our dining table more than once, speaking in calm, measured tones about things that always seemed too distant to matter at the time. I stared at his name for a moment, then pressed call. The line rang twice before he answered, his voice steady, familiar, carrying that same quiet professionalism I remembered. "Margaret," he said, as if the years between our last conversation had been nothing more than a brief pause. "It has been a while." I did not waste time with pleasantries. Not because I wanted to be abrupt, but because there was a clarity in me now that did not require softening. "It has," I replied evenly. "I need to review the documents my husband prepared. All of them." There was a brief silence on the other end, not surprised, not questioning, just acknowledging. "Of course," he said. "I can have everything ready for you first thing after the holiday." I looked out the window as he spoke, watching the snow continue its quiet descent, covering the street in an even, unbroken layer. "Tomorrow morning," I said, my voice calm but firm. Another pause, slightly longer this time, then a quiet shift in his tone. "I will make arrangements," he replied. 10 o'clock work for you?" "Yes," I said. 10 o'clock is fine." When the call ended, I set the phone back down gently, not with hesitation, but with finality. The decision had been made, not out of anger, not out of a need to prove anything, simply because it was time to stop standing still. Across town, I imagined the evening unfolding in a way that looked effortless from the outside. Laughter filling the rooms, the clink of glasses, the easy rhythm of a gathering that had been carefully arranged to feel seamless. Rachel moving through it all with quiet confidence, adjusting small details, guiding conversations, ensuring that everything remained exactly as it should be. Daniel beside her, present but distant in a way that had become so natural it no longer seemed noticeable. I did not need to see it to understand it. I had seen enough over the years to recognize the pattern. What mattered now was not what they were doing, but what I was no longer willing to do. I stood up and walked toward the tree once more, kneeling down in front of the presents. For a moment, I simply looked at them, taking in the careful wrapping, the names written, in my own hand. Then, without rushing, I began to gather them one by one. Not tearing the paper, not undoing the ribbons, just lifting each box and placing it back into the closet nearby, stacking them neatly, deliberately. The motion was quiet, controlled, almost methodical. When I finished, the space beneath the tree was empty, the absence visible but not unsettling. It felt accurate. I closed the closet door and stood there for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the wood, then turned back toward the living room. The tree lights still glowed, unchanged, but the room itself felt different now. Not hollow, not waiting, just still, in a way that no longer demanded anything from me. I returned to my chair and sat down, folding my hands once more, the same position I had held earlier, but with a different weight behind it. The night moved forward, steady and quiet, and I did not try to interrupt it. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the next step. Not dramatic, not loud, just precise. And this time, it would not be about holding on. It would be about deciding exactly what I was ready to let go of and what I intended to keep. The morning came with a quiet certainty that felt different from the day before, as if something had settled into place overnight and was now guiding each movement without hesitation. I woke before the alarm, the pale winter light already stretching across the ceiling, and for a moment I lay still, not out of reluctance, but because there was no longer anything pulling me in multiple directions. The house remained silent, but it no longer felt heavy. It felt contained, steady, like a space that belonged fully to me again. I rose slowly, moving through my usual routine without distraction, each step deliberate, each action carrying a sense of purpose that had been missing for longer than I cared to admit. In the kitchen, I prepared coffee the same way I always had, measuring carefully, waiting for the slow drip, but this time I did not linger by the window or allow my thoughts to drift elsewhere. I drank it at the table, alone, but not waiting. At exactly 9:30, I put on my coat, buttoning it with practiced ease, and took one last look at the living room before stepping out. The tree still stood, its lights now dim in the daylight, no longer the centerpiece of anything, just an object in a room that had already begun to shift beyond it. The drive into town was quiet, the roads lightly dusted with snow, the world moving at a slower pace that matched the steady rhythm of my thoughts. I did not turn on the radio. I did not need background noise to fill the space. By the time I reached the office building, I felt composed in a way that did not require effort. Thomas Reynolds was already waiting when I arrived, standing just inside the doorway, as if he had anticipated the exact moment I would step through. He greeted me with a nod, his expression professional but not distant, and led me into his office without unnecessary conversation. The room was warm, orderly, much like I remembered, everything in its place, nothing left to chance. He had already arranged the documents on the desk, neat stacks of paper aligned with precision, each one representing a piece of something that had been carefully constructed long before I needed to understand it. I took my seat without hesitation, removing my gloves and placing them beside me, then reached for the first document. We did not rush. There was no need. Thomas explained each detail in clear, measured terms, but I found that I required less explanation than either of us might have expected. The structure was simple, deliberate. The house remained entirely in my name. The accounts, the investments, the provisions, all designed with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. My husband had not relied on assumption. He had relied on certainty. I listened, nodded when necessary, asked only a few questions, each one direct, each answer reinforcing what I had already begun to understand. When we reached the final document, Thomas paused, his hand resting lightly on the paper before sliding it toward me. "This," he said quietly, "is the section that allows you to make adjustments should circumstances change." I looked down at it, reading slowly, taking in the language, the options laid out with careful precision. Adjustments. The word lingered for a moment, not heavy, not dramatic, just accurate. I picked up the pen he had set beside the documents and held it between my fingers, feeling its weight, the simple solidity of something that could alter the direction of everything that came after. There was no rush in the moment, no pressure, just a clear understanding of what had already shifted and what now needed to follow. I signed where it was required, my hand steady, the movement controlled, final in a way that did not need to be announced. When I finished, I placed the pen back on the desk and looked up at Thomas, who met my gaze with a quiet acknowledgement. No questions, no commentary. It was not his place to ask. It was mine to decide. We concluded the meeting without ceremony, the papers gathered, the arrangements confirmed, everything set in motion with a precision that mirrored the clarity I now carried with me. As I stepped back outside, the cold air met me again, sharp but not unwelcome, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like something that moved through me rather than something I needed to endure. I walked to my car, the snow beneath my feet soft and even, leaving clear impressions that did not disappear immediately. And as I drove away, the town quiet around me, I realized that what had once felt like loss had become something else entirely. Not an ending, not even a beginning, just a shift that no longer required permission to exist. When I returned home, the house greeted me with the same quiet stillness, but it no longer felt like something waiting to be filled or explained. It simply was, and for the first time, that felt enough. I hung my coat in its place, smoothing the fabric without thinking, then walked into the living room where the tree still stood, unchanged, its lights now faint against the midday brightness filtering through the windows. The space beneath it remained empty, exactly as I had left it, and I paused there for a moment, taking in the absence without discomfort. It felt honest. I moved to the table and picked up my phone, holding it lightly, not with anticipation, but with intention. There were no new messages from Daniel. No missed calls. The silence from his side remained consistent, almost predictable in its absence. I did not interpret it anymore. I simply accepted it as part of the reality that had already revealed itself. I unlocked the screen and opened my contacts, scrolling once again to his name. This time, I did not pause. I pressed it, not to call, but to open the message thread that had ended so abruptly the night before. I read the last words once more, not searching for meaning, but confirming what had already been decided. Then, slowly, I began to type. My fingers moved without hesitation, the words forming clearly, without emotion clouding their shape. I hope you had the peaceful Christmas you wanted. I have taken care of everything on my end. Going forward, there will be some changes. You do not need to worry about me anymore. I stopped there, reading the message in its entirety, making sure it said exactly what it needed to say, nothing more, nothing less. There was no accusation in it. No explanation. Just a quiet statement of fact. I pressed send. The message delivered instantly, the small confirmation appearing beneath it before the screen dimmed once again. I set the phone down gently and exhaled, not heavily, not dramatically, just enough to release the last trace of something that no longer needed to be held. The rest of the afternoon passed without urgency. I moved through the house, not rearranging it, not trying to restore it to something it had been, but simply existing within it as it was now. At some point, I returned to the hallway and stood in front of the photographs again, but this time I did not linger on each one. I saw them all at once, as pieces of a story that had already been told, already completed in its own way. I reached up and adjusted the last frame, aligning it with the others, then stepped back, satisfied not with the image itself, but with the clarity it represented. As evening approached, the light outside softened once more, the snow reflecting a quiet glow back into the room. I turned on the tree lights again, not out of habit, but because I chose to. The room filled with that familiar warmth, but it no longer carried expectation. It was simply light in a space that belonged to me. I sat down in my chair and folded my hands, the same posture I had taken the night before, but with a different weight behind it. There was no waiting now, no wondering if the phone would ring, if a message would arrive, if something would change. Everything that needed to change already had. The silence remained, but it no longer pressed in from all sides. It settled gently, like the snow outside, covering what had been without erasing it completely. Somewhere across town, the remnants of their celebration were likely being cleaned up, the decorations put away, the routine returning to normal. I did not picture it in detail anymore. I did not need to. What mattered was not where I had been excluded, but what I had chosen to reclaim. And as I sat there, the soft glow of the tree steady and quiet, I realized that peace is not something given to you by others. It is something you decide to keep, even when everything around you suggests you should let it go. I leaned back slightly, allowing that thought to settle fully, not as a realization, but as a conclusion. They had wanted a peaceful Christmas. And in the end, so had I. The difference was, I no longer needed their invitation to have it.